the soft hush of a medieval morning, long before the rooster's snooze button was even an idea, the sun crept over the thatched rooftops of a sleepy English village. The frost, as persistent as unpaid rent, coated everything from splintery door latches to the brittle stalks left behind after harvest. Somewhere inside a wattle and daub cottage, a peasant twitched beneath a lumpy wool blanket made from the very sheep that occasionally slept beside him. Yes, we begin our journey here, among the humble and the chilly. Because when it came to winter, medieval peasants didn't get a lot of wiggle room. They had no central heating, no hot cocoa, and not even a flickering YouTube fireplace with suspiciously high production values. So how did they endure the biting cold of the Dark Ages? Well, the answer lies in layers, quite literally. A peasant's approach to winter was less about battling the cold and more about outlasting it through sheer stubbornness and strategic layering. Underlayers of wool, overcoats of thicker wool, cloaks made from what could be begged, borrowed, or badly stitched after a fermented ale or two. Clothes were worn until they nearly walked off on their own. Some observers at the time, not that peasants had many, might have noted fashion was less couture and more don't freeze. Heating, such as it was, came from the hearth. But you may be imagining a merry little fire surrounded by rosy-cheeked children and fresh bread. The reality was often more like a smoky, wheezing fire in the middle of the room, vented through a hole in the roof, with all the enthusiasm of a hungover squirrel. Chimneys weren't common until several centuries later, so instead of the warmth rising elegantly with a plume of inspired embers, smoke sometimes just hung there, stubborn and clingy, like gossip in a small town. But that smoke, inconvenient as it was, helped fumigate the thatched roof and keep bugs at bay. In a curious twist of unintended peasant luxury, their petite dose of suffocation significantly reduced the risk of lice. Firewood was precious, gathered during the autumn months with tremendous care. For some lower-ranking peasants, limited access to the local woods meant trespassing wasn't just a jaunt in the snow. It was a crime, punishable by fines or, in the more dour interpretations of justice, very public embarrassment. So some families resorted to burning dry dung, compact, smoky, and slightly less celebratory at Christmas. At night, most families huddled together in one room, often with chickens, pigs, or an occasionally affectionate goat. There's warmth in numbers, they said, but they also said it through chattering teeth. Beds were stuffed with straw or hay, occasionally dotted with the itchy surprise of burrs. Blankets were woolen, and sometimes the entire family would share a single one, modesty being far less important than keeping one's kneecaps from freezing mid-dream. Food played its role too. In the colder months, porridge was the go-to fuel for body and soul. It wasn't just for breakfast. It might follow you into lunch, dinner, and what you swore was a midnight snack, even if stars were the only working clock you owned. Oats and barley, boiled with water, maybe a slice of winter apple or dried root for morale. On special days, a drizzle of honey, assuming your neighbor the beekeeper hadn't caught you peering hungrily over their hedge. To stave off cold from the inside, ale was consumed. Regularly. It was weak, home-brewed, and served barely cooler than the outside air, but it was safer than water, and often more comforting than any sermon. Children drank it, adults depended on it, and everyone blamed it when someone accidentally walked into the community well. Yet in all this, there was resilience and even joy. Long winter nights were filled with stories told by lamplight, songs played on carved flutes, or simply hummed beside the crackling hearth. It was a season of rest from the relentless rhythm of fieldwork. And while the bones ached and frost made itself an uninvited guest, there was a strange kind of peace that wrapped itself around the tucked-away villages, like the last blanket stitched from last year's memories. So, the secret of surviving a medieval winter wasn't grand invention or fireproof armor made from turnips. It was the quiet magic of community, of resourcefulness, and the somewhat smoky charm of knowing that comfort isn't always found in temperature, but in togetherness. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, lie back, breathe in deeply, and let the smoke gently rise through the hole in your metaphorical thatch. Picture this. A gloomy December twilight spreads across a thatched medieval village like a grey wool blanket thrown by a sleep-deprived shepherd. The chickens are grumbling themselves to bed. The cows are emitting the occasional mournful moo, and the wind outside howls just enough to remind you that your door is made of roughly nailed-together planks and optimism. Inside the average peasant's house, and yes, we're talking the down-to-earth, calloused hand, turnip soup kind of peasant, things were, at best, rustic. Picture a single-room dwelling, cramped as a hamlet's gossip circle, with your entire family, possibly a few chickens, and maybe that one pig who wanders in uninvited but is too charming to throw out. Walls were usually wattle and daub. For those less familiar, that's a construction technique made of woven wooden strips, the wattle, covered in a delightful mixture of soil, straw, and yes, animal dung, the daub. So if you've ever lamented your apartment's questionable drywall, just remember, someone in 1348 was snoring contentedly beneath a wall, held together by cow, droppings and fervent hope. Now, as you drift closer to slumber, set your imagination gently inside this home. There is no central heating. The fire, if there is one, puffs sulkily in the hearth while struggling to warm more than a 3-foot radius. And logs, well, they weren't exactly lying around waiting to be burned. Wood had to be gathered, which was often a dicey proposition when everything beyond your fence belonged to the local lord, his moody gamekeeper, or an elderly crone with suspiciously owlish habits. So, rather ingeniously, folks found passive ways to insulate themselves from the cold. First, layering. The average peasant was probably wearing enough linen and wool to qualify as a fabric onion. Undergarments, overdresses, multiple tunics, a hood or wool cap. Basically, every piece of clothing you and your family owned became part of your daily winter ensemble. If it fit on your body, it was worn. If it didn't, well, it doubled as a blanket, or stopped a draft in the door. But here's a charming little twist of daily life. Bed sharing. Not for the sake of love or comfort, but because human bodies are essentially inefficient little radiators. And in the absence of heating, group bedtime was community survival. Parents, children, grandparents, occasionally servants, all ping-ponged into one communal sleeping area. Sacks of straw acted as mattresses. Blankets were woven from wool or, if you were lucky, fleece. And personal space was, in the winter months at least, a faint and whispery dream. Animals might sleep indoors too. Not just for company, though Bessie the cow could be surprisingly warm-hearted, but because their body heat contributed to overall comfort. A sleepy pig makes a rather excellent foot warmer, if one can ignore the snoring and occasional onion breath. As far as quarrels go, which do tend to pop up when one is wedged shoulder to shoulder with 3 siblings and a goat, the chill air provided a deterrent. After all, storming off in a huff loses impact when the only available exit is the icy night, and you've no spare shoes. Interestingly, windows were either luxury items or, more often, just holes covered with parchment or oiled cloth. See-through-ish, but not what you'd call weatherproof. Glass was reserved for churches, castles, and people wealthy enough to afford toothbrushes, which is to say, no one in this village. And so, the countryside slipped into winter with this sleepy rhythm of adaptation. Cozy by necessity, warm by togetherness, and profoundly inventive when it came to reusing and rewearing every shard of fabric available. They bundled up, huddled in, and endured the months one stubbornly grey dawn at a time. Eventually, even the fire would die out in the middle of the night. But with a pig asleep by one toe, a younger sibling on the other, and your musty wool cowl pulled over your nose, you tuck in tighter and dream dreams made of spring sunshine and meals featuring something other than turnips. Of course, human warmth only went so far. When the real chills settled in, villagers turned to more ingenious methods to retain warmth even during the bite of morning chores. If you've never tried waking up in the dark, inside a freezing wattle and daub cottage, with frost forming suspiciously close to your undergarments, congratulations. You are not a medieval peasant. Back then, the day began not with the gentle beep of an alarm clock or the smell of freshly brewed coffee, but with the soft, wheezing groans of a cold family piled under one extraordinarily itchy wool blanket. The sort of blanket that you'd swear had been spun under the supervision of a particularly angry sheep. Morning didn't exactly dawn so much as it crept in under the door like a particularly shy ghost, accompanied by the barely audible complaint of the wind sneaking through every crack and nail hole in the timber frame. Privacy, insulation, and the general concept of personal space were wildly modern fantasies. Your breath fogged visibly inside the room. Snow sometimes formed inside your home during rough winters. And no, this was not a charming rustic feature. They didn't have Pinterest. One might assume that the solution was to light a hearty fire and gather round like characters in a heartwarming cottagecore daydream. But alas, firewood was more a privilege than a right. It was precious, and people didn't just toss logs on flames with gleeful abandon. That was the behavior of kings and reckless poets. For your average peasant, wood was collected sparingly, sometimes from hedgerows, sometimes gleaned illegally from the Lord's forest when no one was looking, unless you fancied a fine or a few days in the stocks. So, in most homes, the fire, when available, wasn't on all day. It was lit and tended carefully, like a particularly grumpy pet. The hearth was the heart of the household, but not in the central heating sort of way. More in the don't sit too close or your only shoes will melt, but if you sit too far, you'll lose a toe to frostbite way. Thus, warmth was derived not from abundance, but from strategy. You wore your clothes to bed, all of them. Possibly borrowed a few from your siblings. Layers weren't fashion statements. They were survival tactics. Wool, linen, and animal hides were stacked upon each other like medieval lasagna, and people huddled together. Children, parents, grandparents, the absurdly judgmental family rooster. It was communal body heat or bust. Even livestock occasionally came inside. A small goat in the kitchen wasn't a sign of losing control. It was just a sign that the goat was safer from the cold in there than outside getting wind-chapped. Besides, it also added a certain rustic ambience and mild chaos. As for bathing in winter, the idea of leaping into an icy stream for a quick scrub was, understandably, out of season. People generally postponed washing, unless absolutely necessary. Medieval cleanliness was more about shifting layers of dirt strategically than removing them completely. And honestly, the dirt itself might have provided a bit of insulation. That's likely not what they'd tell you, but we're going to count it anyway. Now, in terms of drinking something warm to fight off the chill, hot cocoa and tea didn't exactly feature in the average peasant's kitchen inventory. What they could do, though, was mull some weak ale or heat, a bit of spice cider when opportunity struck. Herbs were used liberally, sometimes for flavor, but often in the faint hope they'd warm your soul or protect against supernatural cold breezes blamed on impish spirits or, more scandalously, the neighboring village. Speaking of neighbors, visiting one in winter had less to do with cheerful socializing and more to do with gathering around someone else's marginally hotter hearth. Peasant hospitality was often literal warmth sharing. If your friend had a fire and you didn't, well, time to invent a reason to stop by and discuss this year's pig tax. Of course, fashion was dictated by necessity. Cloaks were paramount. Thick, hooded things, often greased with fats to repel water, and occasionally smelling faintly of sadness and mutton. Mittens, as we know them, weren't common, but wrapping your hands in cloth or shoving them into fur-lined pockets, or fellow peasants, was entirely acceptable. Shoes were more like semi-waterproof leather suggestions. Socks, if you had them, bless your feet, but mostly it was cloth wrapped creatively and possibly reinforced by optimism. So how did medieval peasants survive winter without fire blazing merrily at all hours? Through layers, livestock, and a communal pact not to acknowledge how cold everyone actually was. Cozy is a relative term, and in the medieval world, you didn't complain about the icy breeze through your door. You just named it and pretended it was a friend. Now, if you're feeling cozy enough to drift off, just imagine the soft sound of a wooden door creaking open and a pair of frost-crusted shoes trading places with thick woolen socks, hand-stitched, slightly damp, but deeply appreciated. And there, beside the quiet ember glow of a dwindling hearth, we find someone preparing not for sleep, but for a long, dark evening, keeping watch for old midwinter traditions that brought a flicker of magic to even the darkest days. There's something undeniably poetic about medieval socks. Not their elegance, mind you. These weren't designer knits hand-woven by sylvan seamstresses beneath moonlight. No, medieval socks were more inventive than beautiful. Imagine tea cozies shaped like elephant trunks, made from leftover wool and good intentions. Yet within their saggy fibers lay the humble genius of a peasant determined not to freeze their toes off. You see, when the cold crept in, quietly, like a scandalous friar sneaking seconds at supper, every peasant had their winter rituals. And at the heart of them, layers upon layers, and then one layer more, just to be safe, wrapped like some jittery cabbage bracing for frost season. Wool, scratchy, damp-loving, and suspiciously aromatic, was the ubiquitous hero of the era. It was everywhere, much like Jeff the goat, who was both warmer than an extra blanket and slightly more judgmental about peasant fashion. But wool had its quirks. It didn't always keep out water, and you had to keep dancing just a little to stay warmer than a bowl of yesterday's gruel. Still, it was better than nothing. Better than linen, which, while lovely for medieval poetry and summer breezes, was like strapping yourself in tissue during a snowstorm. So how did one manage without a roaring fire in every room? Therein lies the magic of medieval creativity, and a healthy fear of catching your roof on fire. Most peasants didn't have proper chimneys. A chimney was what you built, once your house had walls that stood up straight, and taxes that no longer included a chicken to the Lord once a fortnight. Instead, the average family house had what can only be described as a strategically placed smoke hole, which sounds romantic, but also meant that smoke liked to linger, mingle with your lungs, and kiss you goodnight with a wheeze. This limited the fire situation. One fire, usually central, hovering low in the middle of the room. More smoulder and smoke than blazes and brilliance. The goal wasn't to warm the home like a medieval spa day, but simply to stop the children from turning into icicles. Everything, therefore, rotated around that sacred hearth. It was the cooking spot, the light source, the place where Granny sharpened stories sharper than her knitting needles. Peasants would huddle close, knees tucked, arms out, wearing layers thick enough to audition as scarecrows. Children played the official winter sport, flinch while embers snap at your ankles, often followed by blame the goat. But true warmth, true medieval winter luxury, was something far more intimate. Human body heat. Imagine, if you will, a family of 5, an elderly aunt sleeping diagonally, and a dog of indeterminate species, all crammed into one straw mattress affair. It wasn't elegant. There were questionable smells and the occasional rogue chicken, but nestled together beneath blankets of wool and imagination, warmth was shared like a family secret. And yet the bed itself deserves its moment here. A cryptic contraption of ropes, hence the phrase sleep tight. A straw mattress, crunchier than your favorite breakfast cereal, and sometimes a feather topper, if your household had recently hosted a goose-related disaster. The blankets were often thick woven cloths, reused year after year after. Well, let's just say forever. You didn't wash them, you aired them, and everyone agreed that was close enough. For those living in particularly drafty homes, the kind where the north wind entered like it paid rent, there were winter workarounds. Windows, if you had them, were sealed with oiled parchment, a kind of medieval saran wrap, only slightly more flammable. Doors were covered with thick animal hides, and in case of serious storms, the livestock weren't just guests in your barn, they would star in your living room, heating via passive cow, if you will. In even colder regions, people would dry bracken, a kind of fern, straw, or rushes to spread across floors for extra insulation. Essentially, peasants turned their floors into crunchy, occasionally crawling carpets. If that didn't warm your feet, at least it trained you to get really good at hopping about. And all this was done nightly, seasonally, without complaint. Or rather, with the sort of complaint that's mostly yelling at the cat when she takes the warm spot by the fire. Eventually, as the flames settled into embers and the house grew quiet save for the low mutterings of dreams and digestive processes, the winter night wrapped itself around the cottage like a particularly biting lullaby. But there was one more ally against the cold, something worn by old crones and hopeful bachelors alike. In the curious choreography of staying alive during a medieval winter, food was more than nourishment. It was strategy, storytelling, and, on occasion, an extreme sport. While we've so far sidled along the frosty timbers of village life, it's time, dear dreamer, to crack open the kitchen pantry. Metaphorically, of course. Real ones were often just drawers in the wall, or, for the frugal peasant, a clay pot and a prayer. You might imagine winter meals in the Middle Ages were rich, bubbling affairs, bestirred by cloaked figures around a roaring hearth. That was mostly the aristocracy. For your average peasant, dinner plans were faintly more desperate and rarely involved fresh truffles or spit-roasted pheasant with a juice of anything. Instead, Winter meals were a patient negotiation with whatever had not yet sprouted mold or been nibbled into oblivion by rodents ambitious enough to attend culinary school. Preserved foods were the stars of the show. Not preserved as we know it. No vacuum-sealed Tupperware here, but smoked, salted, dried, or buried in earthen jars until the smell was tolerable. Meat, if they could get it, was often salted for winter. Salt wasn't just a flavouring, it was a financial investment, delicate as gold and hoarded like family secrets. A side of pork, salted and hung from the beams of the hall, retreated slowly into leather over a few months. Edible? Yes. Delicious? Only if your standards are delightfully low. More often, peasants leaned into pottage, an endless stew of odds and ends that simmered perpetually in a cauldron over the fire. It was, in theory, always on. A medieval slow cooker, if you will, stewing melancholy turnips with yesterday's beans, last week's barley, and a suspicion of cabbage that had seen better days. If a noble passed through and game became available, perhaps a brace of not too diseased rabbits, celebration ensued, but mostly, meatless boredom was the potage du jour and potage du toujours. Bread was life, and sometimes as dense as your uncle's war stories. Rye or barley bread was typical among peasants, the wheatier loaves being trifled with by those with better shoes. Flour was mixed, dough was kneaded, and then crustified in community bake ovens, where villagers timed their baking with the sun, gossip, and sheer optimistic guessing. Winter bread came from grain harvested and stored during warmer months, often shared communally or taxed into non-existence by local lords. Sometimes flour was extended with ground-up beans, or, in harder years, with bark. Yes, bark. It's said that hardship builds character, and few things build character like gnawing on something last enjoyed by livestock. Dairy was seasonal, of course. Cows and goats didn't produce much when the grass turned to frost, and their expressions tilted toward existential dread. But hard cheeses, made in summer, could sometimes survive deep into winter, tucked away in wrappings of wax or linen. Or optimism. Butter was a luxury, swiftly rancid if not kept chilled, which wasn't hard in winter but rarely properly done. That lovely creamy spread could double as a candle if needed. Truly, medieval multitasking at its finest. We must of course mention ale, not just for parties and inebriated minstrels stumbling into hedgerows, though certainly that happened more than occasionally, but also because drinking water was suspect at best. Ale was often brewed weak, what we might call small beer, just enough alcohol to kill the sinister critters lurking within untreated wells. Children drank it, old women swore by it, and entire villages functioned on a light buzz. Then there were root vegetables, unsung heroes of the peasant table. Parsnips, onions, turnips, and carrots of a palate unfortunate to modern eyes, all stored in cellars, packed in straw, or buried like treasure. Perfect for soups, gruels, or unsuccessful attempts at flavour. Spices, you ask? Only if a travelling merchant took a wrong turn and agreed to trade pepper for 3 chickens, your cousin's shoes, and a vigorous back rub. Comfort food in the wintertime was perhaps less cheerful and more chewable, but it brought people together, huddled around bowls and firelight, trading stories while their teeth worked overtime. Meals weren't just food, they were ritual. They were a shield against the cold, a reminder that in the heart of the darkest months, warmth could be stirred into something from nearly nothing. As you drift now, belly full of imaginary pottage and ale made from cloudy memories, let us dim the tallow candle and wander quietly into the next flickering thought. another part of this cold, beautiful world awaits, where even simple things like clothing were spun with ingenuity and a rather brave amount of wool. Across the frost-laced fields and creaking timbers of the thatched peasant cottages, there rose a smoky question into the stagnant winter air. What did medieval folk even eat when crops were long gone, and the bread felt more like a roof tile than anything remotely chewable? The answer, as with most things medieval, is both humbler than expected and surprisingly clever. Let us enter the low-beamed kitchen of a winter-bound peasant family, where the hearth tries its best to imitate a sun, but mostly just glowers in the corner like a moody orange cat. The walls are kissed by soot, and everything smells a little like damp wool, onions, and resignation. And yet, here is where some of the most fascinating strategies of winter survival played out. In pots, on knives, and beneath cellar hatches. Without a fire, food was not just cold, it was inedible. Boiled grains, porridge, stews. Peasant cuisine was a parade of wetter than expected. But the method was brilliant in its simplicity. A large iron pot, the medieval multi-cooker, hung over the hearth, and into it went whatever could be spared. Cabbage that had seen better seasons, a length of salted pork that more closely resembled a riddle than a cut of meat, and broad beans that were no longer broad. The stew wasn't remade each day. It was infinite. New bits were added as old bits were eaten. Sometimes referred to as perpetual stew, it could bubble for days, weeks, months, if no one got too philosophical about it. Grain, though, the modest hero, was at the centre of most meals. A peasant could almost measure the seasons by sack and chaff. Barley porridge, gruel, and the infamous brown bread, heavy as gilt and twice as chewy, made up a great deal of winter fare. It was kept in storage from the year's harvest and guarded like treasure, which, technically, it was. Entire families subsisted on it during the frozen dullness of January, often drying and rehydrating bread as needed. If dunked into stew, it even lost the power to dull chewing teeth. Of course, no discussion of medieval winter food would be complete without root vegetables. These humble under-earth citizens were the celebrities of the cold season. Turnips, parsnips, and onions, dirty, nobbled, and tough as old books, were pulled from cellars and pits where they'd been stored in straw, damp mud, or pure hope. Carrots came too, though they were often purple, which today would fetch a high price at a farmer's market, but back then caused no excitement whatsoever. Salt was a bit of a deity, used to preserve what little meat could be butchered before the chill made the blade unnecessary. Salt allowed for pork, fish, and sometimes beef to survive until February without developing personalities. Dried fish, often herring or cod, came stiffer than most medieval furniture and had to be soaked before consumption, not unlike a 14th century version of instant noodles, except remarkably more fish-like and less instant. Cheese made its appearances in the winter too, if you'd been clever or cow-having during warmer months. Hard, aged, like questionable wisdom, it could be sliced, crumbled, or grated. In many ways, medieval cheese is the ancestor of modern insomnia food, just lacking the crackers. Fruit, forget the juicy kind. Apples and pears were stored too, but only the hardiest varieties survived, their skins growing waxy with time. Dried plums and berries popped up in pottages and desserts, though calling these desserts might upset modern pastry chefs. Lumpy sweet mush might be a more accurate term, but in the depths of winter, lumpy mush could taste like a royal feast. Not everyone fared the same, of course. The well-stocked manor might have fancier things tucked away: spices, honey, and meat pies that actually contained meat. But the peasant diet was a study in resilience, conservation, and culinary compromise. It wasn't decadent, but it was steady, like a kind but unpolished uncle who always showed up with turnips and advice. And so, as night fell over the wind-chilled cottages and pots simmered with the promise of just enough, the medieval peasant found nourishment in slow stews, storied roots, and the scrape of brown bread over a wooden plate. They may not have dined with extravagance, but somehow they dined all the same. Now, as the embers settle and the pot bubbles sleepily in the background, we might gently tiptoe onward to consider the curious role of animals in keeping the winter chill at bay. When it came to surviving winter in the medieval world, one item held great sway over comfort and warmth: the woolen tunic. Yes, wool, the ancient miracle fiber that's scratchy enough to exfoliate your soul, but insulating enough to hug you like a sheep with commitment issues. And back in the 12th century, if you weren't swaddled in at least 2 layers of it by mid-November, you might as well have written "future frostbitten ghost" on your forehead and curled up with the cows. Peasants rarely had the luxury of changing wardrobes with the seasons. They had one main outfit, often referred to as their Sunday best, which was also their Monday to Saturday worst, because that was literally it. Made mostly of coarse, undyed wool, these tunics soaked in the atmosphere of the home, the hearth, and unfortunately, several winters' worth of unwashed productivity. But what they lacked in diversity, they made up for in resilience. Wool, for all its charming itches and occasional smouldering capabilities near open flames, was a godsend. It repelled water like a grumpy cat repels affection, and even when it got wet, it could retain warmth. This meant that even if your morning included a regrettable slip into a puddle that doubled as both a road and a drainage system, you could still trudge back to your crofter's hut warmish and smelling of wet sheep. And peasants didn't stop at tunics. They layered like onions with abandonment issues. Over the base woolen garment came heavier cloaks, sometimes fastened with a reused bit of cord or a wooden toggle that doubled as a soup spoon in times of scarcity. These cloaks weren't tailored with high fashion in mind, unless fashion to you involves looking like an undercooked turnip wrapped in fabric. But for warmth, they were borderline miraculous. Children, too, were caught up in the great woolen campaign. Dressed in miniature versions of their parents' garb, they toddled about like tiny brigands, chasing chickens and frost with equal abandon. Knitted socks weren't a thing yet. Knitting wouldn't become en vogue in Europe until later in the Middle Ages. But null binding was around, sort of like knitting's scrappy great aunt, wielding a single needle and a lot of optimism. So if a peasant's toes were wrapped in anything in the 1100s, it was likely a repurposed bit of cloth, wool scraps, or their own bitter resolve. Headgear, of course, completed the look. The hoods and coifs of the era weren't just stylish. They were insulation for the brain. A woolen coif could trap heat like a somber oven. Add to that a scarf, often just a long strip of whatever cloth one had, and your average villager was essentially under several layers of self-spun armor against the icy bite of winter. Yet, even amid all the bundling, clothes had to earn their keep. Peasants rotated their outerwear like seasonal crops. One outfit was worn continuously, then aired out, ideally with the wind, but often with whatever dry surface one could find. Washing was rare, not because peasants loved a good stink, but because soap was precious. Drying garments in winter was nigh impossible, and if you owned 2 tunics, you were unofficially knighted warden of textile abundance. It's worth mentioning underclothing, or the lack thereof. The medieval peasant rarely wore undies as we would recognize them. Linen, the fabric usually reserved for undergarments, was expensive and better used as bandages, shrouds, or bridal veils, sometimes all three within 1 week, depending on the harvest. So it was wool-to-skin contact most of the way down, which built character, and likely an impressive resistance to chafing. At bedtime, peasants didn't change into sleepwear. They simply slept in what they wore. Wearing your clothes overnight helped retain body heat, especially in cold, damp cottages with more drafts than a medieval tavern bard's unfinished songbook. You might remove your belt or shoes, but the tunic stayed on. It was both couture and comforter, fashioned from the dual threads of rural necessity and unwavering Scottish sheep. And so, while fire may have been hard to come by and blankets were usually shared like village gossip, the peasants' greatest weapon in the frosty months remained their humble garments, layered, lived in, and loyally itchy. Come closer now, and let's lean into the hearth's glow together, because next, we'll explore just how many warm-blooded creatures you could fit into one small cottage before someone ended up sleeping with the geese. Somewhere in the snowy hush of a 14th century morning, a pair of wool-wrapped boots shuffled across a frozen yard, leaving prints like sleepy punctuation marks in the slush. The boots belonged to Edmund the shepherd, whose job, to the modern mind, might seem hopelessly ill-timed for a man aspiring to warmth. But Edmund, with a destiny in sheep and frost, trudged onward, his breath in puffs like miniature steam engines, albeit rather unimpressive ones. It wasn't just Edmund who faced the ice-kissed breath of winter dark and early. Nearly the entire village was intimately familiar with the kind of chill that makes your toes question their life choices. And while today's frost-fighting tools include down jackets that resemble marshmallows and heated blankets with more settings than a medieval council meeting, the average peasant had no such luxury. Back then, heated floors meant a pig had decided to lie on your feet. So how did they cope? Let us peer into the woolly, smoky solutions that whispered warmth into their limb-numbing lives. To begin with, clothing wasn't just fashion, it was survival. Layers weren't merely trendy, they were philosophical. An under-tunic, an over-tunic, curiously thick hose, cloaks, furs, and, if you were lucky, mittens fashioned from last year's rabbit. The philosophy was simple. Become the onion. Wear everything. Always. Wool was the foundation of their seasonal aesthetic. Unlike the itchy horrors produced by bargain bins today, medieval wool could be surprisingly soft when spun and treated properly. It was warm even when damp, which was fortunate, considering everything was always at least slightly damp. The medieval climate was less let it snow, and more let it slush indefinitely. The centerpiece of winter attire was the hood, a sort of cross between a hoodie and a snood that extended over the shoulders. It was popular across all classes, particularly after someone realized it could be dramatically flipped up during gossip. But warmth wasn't solely a matter of wrapping one's body like a turnip in rags. The home itself played a silent, smoky role in the warmth wars. The hearth, located in either the center or side of a one-room house, served as the pulsing heart of the home. It was both oven and heater, ash pit and light show. While it sounds romantic, it mostly filled the room with smoke. Since chimneys were rare luxuries, smoke typically escaped through a hole in the roof, or, in some less fortunate homes, just didn't escape at all. Thus, the early morning vibe in a peasant cottage was often a choice between two moods: suffocating mist or icicle in a hay tunic. This smoky ambience did, however, have unexpected benefits. The layers of soot and tar that clung to roof beams acted as an accidental preservative. Archaeologists have discovered rafters from that era that are still blackened with centuries-old effortful breathing. And then there were the animals. Furry, cloven-hoofed, space heaters. In many peasant houses, animals were welcomed in at night, not because they were adorable. Even medieval cows had attitude, but because their body heat could raise the room's temperature by a few miraculous degrees. Chickens complained, pigs snored, goats occasionally chewed shoes, but they were family, or at the very least, central heating. Nighttime brought yet another ritual of medieval snugness, the bed pile. Most families slept together for warmth, parents, children, the occasionally treacherous cat. Beds were stuffed with straw or hay, and perhaps covered in a woolen blanket that had seen better decades. There wasn't much privacy, but there was a great deal of shared warmth, and possibly the invention of snoring harmonies. And though it's tempting to imagine these long winters as eternally grey, humour persisted. Medieval folk quipped about chilblains, swapped stories of near-frozen toes, and shared cider and mirth around the hearth smoke. There's nothing quite like old jokes about cold weather to keep one warm, especially when uttered through 4 layers and a layer of soot on your teeth. Even so, winter was no gentle guest. It was a test of community spirit, of wool-spinning efforts, of how many goats one could realistically convince to behave indoors. It was also when peasants turned particularly inventive, which brings us to a peculiar little creature they used to ward off the chill. Not a tool, not an animal, but almost forgotten by time, and it just might surprise you. As the wind loomed heavy across the thatched rooftops and the frost tiptoed over window slits with crystalline mischief, a peculiar seasonal rhythm stirred to life in the medieval village. No, not the mulled wine festival or magical carolers with perfect pitch. It was something far more essential to the humble peasant's wintertime well-being. The gathering of moss. Yes, moss. The forest's forgotten pillow, darling of damp stones, and rather conveniently, nature's answer to a medieval insulation crisis. Without central heating or even a reliably functioning chimney, invented, by the way, rather late in the game, peasants had to get a little creative to keep from waking up as lightly chilled meat pies. Cattle and wool wore their coats all year round. Peasants couldn't always afford the same luxury. Enter moss, hay, straw, and anything else short of squirrels that could be stuffed into cracks and crevices without objection or rabies. The technique was called chinking, which sounds like something you might do while toasting goblets in a castle hall. But it was, in fact, a vital part of winter survival. Homes weren't airtight. Most were more sieve than shelter, with wattle and daub walls that let the wind flirt aggressively with the indoors. So families would press moss into the gaps, or even smear extra mud around for injustice-proofing the edges. It was haphazard and earthy, but come January, you'd give your best goat for a few handfuls of damp, green squishiness if it meant fewer drafts on the backside. Meanwhile, the choice of bedding was a serious business, optimized for warmth over aesthetic. Modern memory foam might luxuriously mold to your spine, but medieval bedding preferred the tensile chaos of straw stuffed into sacks or laid loosely atop wooden crates, with maybe an old, somewhat cooperative sheepskin on top. In the deepest parts of winter, families might sleep fully dressed, wool layers and all, beneath piled blankets of woven linen, heavier wool, and any sleeping relatives not deemed too wriggly. And speaking of Wrigley, beds weren't quiet little solo sanctuaries. The concept of personal space was more of a modern invention, right up there with Wi-Fi and not eating bread that had been partially gnawed by mice. Entire families often slept in one large bed, or at least in shared proximity. Children, cousins, elders, and sometimes the odd chicken recovering from frostbite joined the medley. Body heat wasn't just helpful, it was policy. Anyone wondering about medieval pajamas might be fascinated or mildly disappointed to hear that they weren't full of buttoned-up flannel grace and fluffy socks. Instead, sleepwear was usually just whatever you wore that day, assuming it was mildly clean or at least free of fermented cabbage stains. Strip down and catch a chill. No thanks. Full wool tunic, maybe your only tunic. That's a yes. Now, while fireplaces were indeed common in wealthier homes, our average peasant didn't always enjoy the luxury of a roaring hearth. Many cottages had an open fire in the middle of the room, with a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. Sort of a chimney in spirit, if not in masonry. Unfortunately, the smoke was not particularly well behaved. It lingered, tried to form its own social club, and generally filled the room before finally exiting at its leisure through the roof hole, which often doubled delightfully as a snow entryway. This meant that not only did peasants choke through smoke like it was a new form of aromatherapy, they also constantly battled soot. Everything was charred, their clothes, their walls, quite possibly their outlook on winter. Still, the effort to have a flicker of warmth remained worth it, even if you left the fireplace looking and smelling like someone who had lost a duel with a chimney sweep. And should fuel run low, which it often did, alternative heat sources became necessary. One such source was known as the warming pan, which should win an award for being exactly what it sounds like. You'd fill a metal pan with heated stones or embers, then slide it under the bed covers before tucking yourself in, creating a pocket of blessed warmth that sometimes lasted almost a whole hour before reality invaded again. The more ambitious or romantically poetic types may have courted the idea of heated bricks or bottles filled with warm water, cunningly swaddled in cloth. Less prone to catching fire than the burning ember plan, but also prone to premature lukewarming. The bricks were at least safe companions for long winter nights of half sleep and draft dodging. So, as the snow piled on the timber frames outside, and the wind howled its eternal songs through branch and shutter, the medieval family huddled close, layered in whatever warmth they could muster. Moss in the walls, straw in the beds, soot on the ceiling, and love, or shivering dependency, in every corner. And yet, the nights pressed onward, one breath at a time, as something else, once lost to late harvests and frozen rivers, slowly found its place not in the pantry, but in the cellar. Inside the humble walls of a medieval peasant's home, a great many things were not happening. There was no porcelain sink, no thermostat to adjust, and certainly no triple-glazed windows to keep drafts at bay. What they did have, however, was something far more curious. A living ecosystem of survival strategies involving layers of cloth, stubborn livestock, and the warm breath of very poor decisions. Let us drift into one such wintry evening. The peasant family, living in a single-room wattle and daub cottage, is huddled together around the very heart of the home, a smoky, reluctant hearth. The fire, admittedly, is barely clinging to life itself, not unlike the turnips stored in the corner. Wood, after all, is scarce. Trees don't grow overnight, and most of the nearby forest may well belong to the Lord, who would take an axe to your ambitions before he'd let you take one to his oaks. Instead, they burn what they can, mostly peat, dried dung, old twigs, and anything remotely combustible that wouldn't upset the local bailiff. The resulting smoke is not so much cozy as it is medicinal, if your idea of medicine includes watery eyes and the flavour of disappointment. Windows, if the cottage has any at all, are small, unglazed holes that let in the cold and usher out the warmth as if warmth owed them money. These openings are often covered with oiled cloth, animal hide, or wooden shutters that creak and mutter throughout the night, like they're gossiping about how bad things are in there. And what an interior it is. Here, in this wooden-boned cottage, every surface seems committed to absorbing the cold and sharing it generously. The walls are likely insulated with a mixture charmingly known as wattle and daub. Imagine a woven lattice of sticks, slathered with a hearty smear of mud, straw, and, yes, more dung. Impressively sustainable, less impressively warm. But before you shiver on their behalf, remember this. Medieval, peasants had mastered the art of passive warming. Every living thing in that room contributed to the ambient temperature. Not just the people and their perpetual layers of wool and linen, but also the animals. Yes, animals. Chickens, perhaps a pig, or even a milk cow. Cohabitation with livestock was common and, to a surprising degree, strategic. The animals functioned as four-legged radiators, emitting glorious body heat and occasionally opinions. The family slept together in one bed, or more likely, on mats of straw, covered in whatever textiles they could scrape together. Wool blankets, old cloaks, perhaps the tunic they wore yesterday and today, and maybe even tomorrow. The key wasn't individual comfort. It was shared climate control. Human burritos, if you will. Clothing, by the way, wasn't taken lightly. Linen shifts were worn next to the skin and rarely removed, partly due to the chill, partly due to opportunity, or the lack thereof. Over that came layers of wool, earthy, durable, and probably a bit itchy, which, in the grand scheme of things, was a small price to pay for not freezing to death. And if all else failed, they told stories. Stories distracted the mind, brightened the dark, and made the hours pass somewhere between gloom and dreams. Children's eyeballs widened as their grandfather recounted how, one particularly bitter winter, the goat had outsmarted the entire village. Whether or not he embellished this tale is immaterial. What mattered was the warmth of the words, the rise and fall of familiar voices, and the flickering light painting shadows across the thatched ceiling. Now, did they long for comfort? Of course, but not in the way we do. Comfort was a roaring fire, or a softer patch of straw, a night without howling wind, a stew with more than cabbage in it. And when those humble wishes aligned, it felt, in its own quiet way, like luxury. As the embers settle and someone snores softly, possibly a relative, possibly the pig, the winter night outside rumbles on, but inside, beneath wool and whispers, they drift, worn but warm, into sleep. And so, the medieval peasant pushes through another frozen night, stubborn and still, wrapped in cloth, kin, and the occasional livestock. And in that frostbitten perseverance, we find the peculiar genius of those who endured not with might, but with mossy walls, shared warmth, and an unshakable talent for making do. Now, in the distance, beyond the lowing cow and the wind beneath the eaves, a new sound begins to rise. Not the howling of wolves, but the gentle creak of daily necessity, an early riser stirring before first light. While one might assume that a medieval winter came with unrelenting cold and the distant hope of spring, it turns out that peasants face the season with a peculiar mixture of pragmatism, folklore, and a surprising number of onions. No, really. Onions played a rather spirited role in medieval winter survival. But first, let's warm our woolen cloaks and step softly into a peasant's cottage, shall we? Picture the interior. Low ceiling, beams darkened by centuries of smoke, clay floor uneven like a forgotten biscuit tray, and a hearth at the center where whatever modest firewood they had was smouldering valiantly, bravely attempting to warm the room, and not just the dog. The typical peasant dwelling was not, as some historians might put it, insulated in the modern sense. No fiberglass walls or double-paned windows, no thermostats politely clicking to life. Instead, insulation came in the form of thatch packed into walls, mud smeared between wooden posts, and rather charmingly, livestock. Yes, a cow in the living room had more calorific value than it did conversational. The medieval home often welcomed pigs, chickens, and occasionally a goat to sleep indoors. Not as part of a rustic Instagram aesthetic, but because creatures make heat. Nature's water bottles, if you will. One couldn't always count on firewood to keep things cozy. Forest access was severely controlled. Forests were the domain of the lords, the kings, and the foxes, who paid rent in silence and charm. Gathering wood without permission could lead to a fine, or worse, an awkward conversation with the reeve. So what did peasants burn? Enter brushwood, dried peat, or whatever the cow left behind the day before. Let's just say that in the medieval peasant's fireplace, dignity took second place to temperature. Clothing became the next line of defense. Wool was the reigning monarch of winter fashion, and not the sleek, marrow-thin type that modern retailers sell at alarming markups, but the thick, scratchy variety that smelled faintly of sheep and perhaps optimism. Layered smocks, cloaks fastened by simple brooches, and foot wrappings, these created a cozy cocoon of warmth. Underwear, if any, was not especially ambitious, but layering allowed for a sort of medieval thermal technology. Wear more, look like less. And then there were the beds. Not plush feather beds dipped in lavender like a royal might enjoy. Oh no. A peasant might instead sleep on a straw mattress atop a wooden or rope-slatted frame, with their family members tucked in side by side, like books on a shelf. Close for warmth, familial love, and perhaps because there was truly nowhere else to go. Beds were shared not just with kin, but with warmth-storing objects. Hot stones wrapped in cloth, dogs curled into circles, and once again, onions. Let me explain. Onions in the Middle Ages were not just for soup and breathy conversations. Folk medicine suggested that keeping a cut onion by the bedside could absorb sickness, a sort of pungent guardian against plague and misfortune. Did it work? Not really. Did it make the room smell distractingly uninviting to evil spirits and friends alike? Absolutely. But in winter, even a superstitious onion gave the illusion of control. Something to grip tightly as winds howled and roofs creaked under the snow. Time, you see, passed differently in winter. The days were short, the nights long and filled with stories. Peasant families told tales, sang songs, and played simple board games scratched into the table with knives that had chopped everything from turnips to, one suspects, suspiciously enthusiastic rats. Storytelling wasn't just for fun. It was a form of indoor travel. With each tale of kings and monsters, children forgot how cold their toes were, and old men remembered springs they were certain had tasted warmer. And then there was hope, packaged as the winter solstice. Though Christianity officially frowned upon pagan celebrations, old customs lingered like stubborn icicles. The lighting of candles, the greenery hung indoors. These warmed the soul if not the fingers. People marked the turning of the year and quietly celebrated having made it this far again. It wasn't easy. Nothing in medieval winter was. But they adapted, through ingenuity, through communal living, and through a deeply held belief that even the coldest season must eventually break and bloom. And as we gently leave the smoky glow of the peasant's cottage and step into the snow-muted world outside, there's still much left to explore in this drowsy tapestry of past lives and frozen nights. But for now, keep your scarf close and your onions closer. The wind howled over the frozen thatch roofs like a ghost with indigestion, rattling shutters and whistling through the chinks of poorly repaired wattle and daub walls. Inside the peasant's modest abode, however, life pressed bravely on, not with luxurious roaring hearths or warm towels fluffed by the local manor's footman, oh heavens no, but with a few tricks, a lot of blankets, and a solid helping of stubborn optimism. You see, the medieval home, if one can call it that without the ghost of an architect weeping in the background, boasted precious few luxuries. Floors were rarely more than packed earth, sometimes strewn with straw, which acted as insulation in a generous sense. Not the plush straw of fairy tales either. This was the crisp, crinkly, slightly suspicious straw, whose aroma was a fragrant blend of livestock, mystery, and the vague memory of last spring's manure. And yet, medieval folk made it work. At the heart of the home was the fire pit, not a grand fireplace, mind you, but a simple hearth, often little more than some stones in the center of the room. There was no chimney yet in most humble homes. Smoke decided to tour the rafters at its own leisure before eventually slipping out through a hole in the roof, or, perhaps, just through sheer boredom. Breathable air was a concept more associated with monasteries and miracles. But the smoke sauna ambiance had its odd benefits. Besides seasoning the interior walls to a fine smoked oak tone, it also helped preserve timber by discouraging bugs and guests. The family would gather close to this glowing nucleus, drawing warmth from both fire and proximity. Clothing in winter was not so much about fashion as it was about survival. Though it's fair to say burlap has never had its vogue moment. Layers were key. Wool was the miracle fabric of the medieval age, warm, water-resilient, and happily abundant thanks to the region's unimpressed-looking sheep. Tunics over tunics, cloaks held together with pins and prayers, and stockings rolled and roped to legs were normal attire. Underwear, for those who bothered, was a luxury and occasionally someone else's. At night, the great unheating began. The fire would be banked or sometimes let go out entirely, especially if firewood was low, and it often was. Gathering wood could be illegal, depending on your social status and whether or not the king fancied walking through that forest untroubled by commoners. Thank you very much. Laws like the Forest Charter controlled such things, lest Lord Whiskerford stumble upon peasants daring to keep their toes unfrozen. So rather than risk royal wrath, families turned to another age-old solution: body heat. Everyone, parents, children, grannies, the occasional dog, and perhaps a confused chicken, piled into the same bed, not out of affection necessarily, though bonding was a hopeful side effect, but because layering humans was as effective as layering wool. The average family bed was a social event with limited personal boundaries. Privacy in this era was a rumor passed along dusty roads and ignored out of practicality. And let's not forget the bed itself. A wooden frame, if they were lucky, with ropes across to support a mattress of straw or hay. These ropes needed frequent tightening, lest one sag too dramatically and send its occupants cascading into a wintry pile mid-dream. Hence, that old expression, sleep tight. Though in this case, tight referred to ropes, not the literal hugging of limbs for dear warmth. Still, there were perks. Grandma often told stories, not bedtime tales featuring dragons and princesses, but the compelling kind wherein a neighbour fell into the bog and lost his boot, never to reclaim it. Rumours warmed the soul, just slightly. Singing helped too. Quiet lullabies, passed down in sequence, like Jesu, joy of man's desiring, to not freeze his pointy shoes off. Food played its part. A modest dinner might involve pottage, a no-nonsense stew of barley, root vegetables, and luck. Eating something warm before bed served as both comfort and subtle central heating for the belly. Drink helped as well. Ale, served warm and weak, was a common beverage. It may have numbed the cold, or at least made one forget their toes were missing. Most charming, perhaps, were the foot warmers. Not the electric kind, obviously, unless powered by lightning and divine intervention. But humble hot stones warmed by the fire, then wrapped in cloth, were placed at the foot of the bed. These were the peasant world's answer to modern luxuries, though they occasionally also burned holes through otherwise serviceable blankets. Still, as hazards go, it beat freezing solid, and thus our medieval sleeper drifted off to dreamland, with frost near the window slats and a foot in a cousin's armpit. Sleep came not by comfort, but by exhaustion and cleverness, and as frost crept tenderly along the beams of rooftops and night critters padded softly beneath floorboards, you might wonder, what of the animals? Did they slumber out in the bitter wind? Ah, that brings us, rather snugly, to another tale entirely. As snow settled upon the thatched rooftops like whipped cream over barley bread, the villagers of medieval Europe entered their annual season of strategic shivering. Now, you might assume, perhaps from watching far too many films where peasants are inexplicably clean and overly dramatic, that these humble folk merely stoked the hearth, curled up with their livestock, and passed the frosty months swapping riddles and romantic glances by candlelight. But winter, as any seasoned serf would affirm, was less poetry and more logistics. Let's begin with the hearth, the reluctant heart of the medieval home. You see, while modern fireplaces roar like caged dragons in ski lodges, the rural medieval fire was a tamer creature, more smoke than flame, with a stubborn reluctance to heat anything beyond its immediate circle of favourite floorboards. Chimneys weren't yet common in peasant cottages. Those glorious stone funnels were luxuries reserved for castles, manor houses, and people who owned spoons made of metal. Instead, smoke was simply encouraged to find its own way out, drifting lazily through gaps in the roof or crawling across the ceiling like a ghost with a poor sense of direction. This made the air inside the cottage something between mildly smoky and eye-watering. Some clever households, in an attempt to outwit the winter, invited their livestock indoors. Cows, pigs, and even chickens were co-roommates, not out of sentimentality, but for the purely practical benefit of shared body warmth. Was it cozy? Perhaps. Was it odorous? Certainly. But if you were given the choice between frostbite and the gentle musk of Daisy the dairy cow, you might surprise yourself. Then there were the beds, sacred cocoons of warmth and straw, layered with whatever textiles could be spared, woolen blankets, moth-nibbled cloaks, and sometimes even sacks of grain repurposed as foot warmers. People slept close, not just because it was sweet, but because heat shared was heat saved. Families piled in, limbs tangled like a basket of old turnips. Nighttime was less bedtime story and more communal survival event. Evenings followed a bedtime logic all their own. With daylight reduced to a wintry wink, the sun rising as if it had somewhere more important to be, peasants often split their sleep into two phases. First sleep, usually, began a few hours after sunset, around when the last turnip stew was slurped. Then came a waking period in the middle of the night, a time for prayer, sewing, or staring moodily into the hearth, half hoping it might surprise everyone and become slightly warmer. This interval wasn't considered strange. It was common knowledge. If you woke up at midnight and found yourself in a contemplative mood, well, so was Geoffrey the shepherd, 3 doors down, a society synchronized by twilight, firelight, and finicky goats. Clothing wasn't just for daytime either. During winter, peasants would sleep in almost everything they owned. Woolen tunics, linen undershirts, cloaks, shawls, and anything loosely categorized as not frozen. The idea was to trap every possible degree of warmth in a fashion-forward arrangement of layered defenses. Think of it as medieval thermal wear, only somewhat itchier. Of course, their strategies didn't stop indoors. Snow and frost didn't politely wait until spring. They barged in at will, snatching vegetables from buried stores or cracking water buckets like ice sculptures commissioned by chaos. To confront this, peasants devised outdoor solutions as well. Food cellars were insulated with straw, doors were thickened with woolen mats, and children were dispatched to tramp down the snow with their tiny, relentless feet. And let's not forget the communal factor in all of this. Winter wasn't endured in splendid isolation. Villagers leaned on one another, figuratively and literally. They swapped firewood, shared fermented drinks made from questionably stored apples, and gossiped like seasoned diplomats. Neighbors might argue over who pinched whose chicken feed in the spring, but in the cold months, there was an unspoken truce. Warmth was bigger than bickering. So, in a world without radiators, thermal socks, or hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows, the medieval peasant did not merely survive the winter, they collaborated with it. They negotiated its terms, wooed it with wool, and resisted its chill with grim determination and impressively smoke-scented ponchos. And as the frost crept once again along the lattice of cottage windows, and flames sighed into the cloudy air of low, soot-dark hovels, one could almost feel the rhythm of patience, the heartbeat of people knitted close by fire, fabric, and communal stubbornness. As the night deepens like a quiet well, we turn gently now to the curious customs that flickered to life during those long, snowy stretches when time slowed, and even the cold began to tell stories of its own. In the hush of a 12th century January dusk, the humble hearth was not merely a feature of the medieval peasant's home. It was something akin to a seasonal deity, revered, temperamental, necessary. One could live without many things: regular baths, literacy, or even the continued presence of their cow Clementine. But life without fire in deep winter was a slow, shivering vow of suffering. Now, contrary to cozy modern depictions, the village fire wasn't dancing day and night in every home. It didn't neatly simmer in a tidy stone fireplace like something out of a woodland-themed Airbnb. The typical fire was usually cranky, smouldering in a smoky corner near the center of the room, surrounded by stones and cautious hope. The roof may or may not have had a smoke hole. If it didn't, well, the family simply accepted that their lungs were one with the chimney. Fuel, of course, was the first problem. Wood wasn't just lying around awaiting the rustic embrace of every villager. In fact, much of the forest was owned by the lord of the manor. He was, as rulebooks and winter warnings decreed, not particularly keen on peasants traipsing into his woods to gather firewood, especially when said firewood still had ambitions of reaching the next century as an upright tree. So instead, they resorted to what they could find: fallen branches, twigs, shrubs with suspicious identities, and yes, dung. Dried cow patties or sheep droppings pressed into handy shapes like the world's least festive cakes were dried by the hearth and used as fuel. Not terribly romantic, but effective. When your soul is cold and your bed is colder, a dung-burnt glow starts to resemble comfort. This led to the creation of layers upon layers of clothing even inside the home. Cloaks, tunics, undertunics, wool socks, and the occasional stolen bit of the older sibling's blanket were standard medieval winter fashion statements. You didn't change clothes so much as rotate them with strategic whimsy. It wasn't, "What shall I wear today?" but rather, "Which damp woolen mass is the least clammy?" At night, the holy grail of warmth was the communal bed, which sounds either cozy or alarming depending on your modern sensibilities. But in the medieval peasant home, it made elegant if cramped sense. Families, sometimes extended ones, slept together beneath shared layers of straw and wool, limbs knotted like root systems dreaming under frost. Imagine 6 to 10 relatives piled together like a badly engineered lasagna, and you've got the general idea. Sleep was two-phased in those days. It often came in segments. First sleep, a waking period near midnight for quiet tasks and soft conversations, then second sleep. Those between times were occasions for stoking the fire, mending clothes by candlelight, or whispering folk stories with faces lit by the reddening coals, their voices muffled under blankets as if afraid to wake the frost outside. And let us not forget the miracle of hot stones. Stones heated in the hearth were tucked into beds like sleepy sentinels, glowing lightly from the fire's touch. They didn't stay warm for long, but long enough to give your feet a brief moment of believing in paradise. It was the medieval equivalent of an electric blanket, only it sometimes singed your toes and occasionally shattered. But no small price for comfort. Meals, too, played a role in internal warmth. The midday pottage, a thick stew of grains, legumes, and what modest vegetables might have survived winter's judgment, was the edible fireplace of the body. Sometimes even a hint of meat was present. This occurred primarily when a chicken had lost its will to go on, or if a pig had finally decided its legacy should continue in soup form. Village life, despite all this, had its warmth, not just from the fire, but from shared endurance. Singing together while patching cloaks, trading stories to pass the relentless snowdrifts of time, laughing over who had the worst night fart in the communal bed. When you can giggle at your frostbitten behinds and still share the last chunk of parsnip, you've unlocked a warmth fire alone can't grant. Now, as another imaginary log turns to embers in our story's hearth, let us quietly shift from the glowing rooms of peasant homes to a place that rarely felt winter's bite, though it certainly feared it, the Lord's own hall, where fire didn't just warm, it ruled like royalty clad in ash and flame. As winter deepened its frosty grip on the northern countryside, one might assume that all warmth and cheer had fled the world, perhaps stowing away on a merchant ship to the Mediterranean. But medieval peasants weren't ones to despair when temperatures dropped and their breath began fogging up the thatch above them. Instead, they deployed one of the most powerful time-tested tools in their arsenal of winter survival. Community. Now, this is not to suggest that every evening was spent in a jolly group cuddle while singing ancient lullabies, though that does sound rather pleasant. No, what we're talking about here is something far more deliberate and, frankly, more strategic. The art of communal warmth. You see, when a single fire struggles to heat a timber-framed home with enough gaps to negotiate a minor peace accord with the wind, humans turn to the warmth of other humans. Entire households, cousins, and occasionally a friend who just happened to be in town for the next 3 months would sleep in close quarters. Body heat, it turns out, is the most democratic of all heat sources, free, portable, and surprisingly effective when shared generously. Belgian chroniclers, who had far more parchment than anyone reasonably needed, often noted how labourers would cluster like sparrows in barns, huddled under coarse woolen blankets, often just straw-filled sacks upgraded with a stitched emblem of a local saint for extra holiness. Privacy was scarce, personal space even scarcer, but there was comfort in numbers, and sweat, but mostly comfort. In many ways, the medieval peasant village was more in sync with the natural world than we are today. When the sun disappeared by mid-afternoon, so did most productive activity. Night was not for working or scrolling endlessly through handheld sorcery, but for talking softly, telling stories, playing humble games like knucklebones or riddles passed through generations, and yes, for bundling into the collective cocoon of family warmth. There were a variety of innovative sleeping arrangements. Some involved layering, a strategy not only for clothing, but for human beings. The elders and infants, most vulnerable to the cold, were nestled at the center. Around them, other family members formed concentric rings like slightly itchy, sleep-talking seals. In the background, you might hear the comforting crackle of peat on the fire, or just the soft snore of Uncle Wolfbert, who had a talent for falling asleep mid-anecdote and picking it back up days later without missing a beat. Even animals entered the architectural blueprint of nightly warmth. In some homes, especially in regions of northern France, Scotland, and the colder corners of the Holy Roman Empire, livestock stables were built directly adjacent to the living quarters. A few cows in the next room didn't just provide milk, they radiated heat in generous, moo-scented wafts. It was not luxurious by any modern measure, but it was warm, and that counted for everything. The telling of tales, of course, was a heat-generating pastime all its own. A scary story might raise goosebumps, but a well-worn fable or a tale of St. Cuthbert stealthily healing a horse could inspire an inner warmth, that glow of shared culture, identity, and laughter. And laughter, well, laughter is the secret wool of the soul, isn't it? Peasants mocked the weather openly, often personifying winter as a meddling old man with a beard of sleet and a habit of hiding your shoes. Jokes, often endless and occasionally offensive to swine, held considerable power. It's hard to despair when your grandfather is trying to balance a herring on his nose to cheer up the kids. There were known winter songs, sung not with operatic grandeur, but in hoarse, friendly tones. Lullabies to the land and to each other. Soft, rhythmic melodies that chimed steadily as frost collected on the outside shingles. Those songs told stories of spring's return, of things enduring, of elderberry cordial, and of how nobody quite trusted that one sheep with the funny ears. So, while the cold bit at the door and the winds howled like particularly annoyed spirits, the warmth within these peasant homes was not solely the product of a struggling fire or an optimistic pile of straw. It was in the embrace of togetherness, community, the unwavering hope that days would lengthen and that they could get through one more night, perhaps even one more laugh, before sunrise brushed the darkness away. And as chimney smoke curled into the night sky, making lazy loops through the stars, there was a slow, dreaming rhythm in these homes. A rhythm that hummed as softly as a tune shared between a grandmother and a child, too sleepy to stay awake. Let's listen a little longer as the snow begins to fall even, thicker, and travel just gently further into the night. When night draped itself across the thatched roofs of medieval hamlets and the wind began to whisper urgencies through the cracks of timber and wattle, there arrived a cherished ritual among peasants that few history textbooks bother to mention, probably out of jealousy, because, dear dreamer, they never got to experience the unspoken elegance of shared bed warmth. In a world without central heating, or basically any heating that didn't involve firewood and prayer, peasants quickly learned the value of using what they already had: each other. Human beings are portable space heaters after all, and in the bitter chill of a December evening in 1342, there wasn't much that rivaled the toasty effectiveness of tucking in with family, neighbours, and possibly a goat with boundary issues. It wasn't just common, it was expected. The medieval bed, more of a snuggle fortress than a nightly retreat, often had co-sleepers of every stripe. A household of 7 might crowd into 2 beds, 3 if they were luxuriously cramped. The children pressed in first, usually allowed the warm middle, the only time in life when being in the middle is seen as aspirational. Parents were posted on the outside like sentries against the cold, though let's be honest, they probably nudged their way into the cozy core by morning. This kind of sleeping arrangement had practical benefits. Not only did it conserve body heat, it also reinforced a sense of familial closeness. Whether you liked your relatives or not, personal space was a privilege of the future. In the 1300s, if you weren't elbow deep in someone else's dreams, were you even surviving winter? Beds themselves were no great shakes either. If you're imagining ornate 4-posters with feather mattresses, you've wandered into the castles. Back in peasant land, the mattress was often a sack of straw, no memory foam, but excellent for building immunities to both discomfort and bugs. A few lucky folk managed a wool-stuffed mattress, which was considered thrilling and faintly luxurious, despite the fact it smelled significantly like sheep. Sheets, if they existed at all, were made of coarse linen. Most peasants opted to sleep under woolen blankets, thick, itchy, and extremely judgmental. Now you might be thinking, with everyone bundled together like an overfilled pastry, how did people sleep? Well, sleep itself was different then. There's evidence suggesting people didn't sleep in one long stretch, but rather in 2 shorter segments, separated by a quiet interim. During this first sleep, folks would nod off shortly after sundown, wake around midnight, chat quietly, tend to the fire, whisper secrets to each other, perhaps even say a few late-night prayers, and then drift back into the second sleep until dawn. Strange, perhaps. Or maybe we're the strange ones, with our prideful 8-hour sleep demands and overly quiet bedrooms. One might also imagine that large groups sleeping in tight quarters would be riddled with annoyance, but there's a surprising charm in these arrangements. Imagine the gentle symphony of night, the crackle of banked hearth coals, the wheezy snore of Uncle Aldred, the soft shuffling of someone tossing a blanket over a foot that's gone rogue. It was the music of survival, warmth, and routine. And perhaps, when the wind howled especially loud outside the shutters, there might even be stories told in hushed voices, passed down from grandmothers who remembered colder winters or dreamier times. Stories of saints who slept in snowbanks, or foxes who taught villagers how to make soup from turnips and diplomacy. And the warmth, while never luxurious, was enough. Enough to keep fingers and toes attached, spirits slightly lifted, and dreams flickering like embers in the shared darkness. Above, the thatched roof might have groaned under the snow's slow weight, but inside, pressed together, wrapped in ragged wool and each other's breath, the villagers of old made it through. Night after night, winter after winter, no thermostat in sight. As the snows pressed deep into the season and frost painted its silent artwork on the window panes, what truly mattered wasn't wealth or power, but the heartbeat beside your own, steady and warm, beneath a scratchy blanket on a straw bed. But warmth wasn't merely found in closeness or wool. Tomorrow, we'll wander into a curious little medieval invention, one that sits at the edge of bed and hearth and beckons with the promise of secretly toasted toes. The candle flickers low on the wooden shelf, illuminating a corner of the cottage where time itself seems to have curled up for a nap. Outside, the wind sighs like an old man disappointed that winter, yet again, has disrupted his afternoon stroll. Inside the air, a delicate blend of damp wool, cabbage stew, and ambition is thick with the muffled rustlings of a household doing its best to stay not dead. In this frigid, post-harvest hush, the medieval peasant's strategy for surviving the chill had less to do with innovation and more to do with sheer, stubborn proximity. That is to say, they huddled with family, huddled with animals, huddled under cloaks, blankets, and anything vaguely fur-like, even if it once belonged to a relative now inconveniently dead and unable to protest. Homes were designed to optimize heat retention the same way a hedgehog optimizes for being round. Picture a low, one-room cottage with walls made of wattle and daub, essentially mud-plastered twig architecture, and a roof that smoked more often than not. The hearth in the center was often the only source of firelight, heat, and joy, though joy might be too generous a word. Warmish despair, perhaps. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof, where smoke was invited to exit politely if it felt inclined. Most of the time, it lingered indoors like a bored ant, winding its way among rafters, blackening everything with soot, including lungs. Yet somehow, coughing and squinting through smoky air was deemed preferable to freezing to death. Humans, after all, are famously adaptable, especially when the alternative is cumbersome and terminal. Beds were luxurious items, and by that, we mean they consisted of straw stuffed into a woven tick and perhaps elevated slightly off the floor if you're lucky enough to own 4 pieces of furniture and a dream. The whole family might share one bed, or even just one corner of the room, like a pile of particularly chilly kittens. Privacy was a distant fantasy, something vaguely associated with kings, saints, and the dead. At night, bodies combined their thermal output. Children slept head to foot. Nimble grandmas curled in the corners like pastoral nesting dolls, and couples redefined romantic closeness as not perishing together. Taking off one's outer layer at bedtime was a luxury only the globally warm could afford. Instead, they slept in layers. Tunics, hose, occasional sheep pelts. Yes, even a bit of hay if it came to that. And then, there were the animals. No, not because medieval folk treated pigs like pets, but because warm blood is warm blood, regardless of how much it oinks. Chickens, goats, even a small cow, if you had both wealth and optimism, might be brought in during the most brutal months to share their heat with the family. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, the animals lived and the humans didn't freeze. Unfortunately, it also meant that every morning began with the fragrant bouquet of stale breath, steaming muck, and spontaneous udder proximity. Nutrition became the next critical tool in this arsenal of wintry endurance. Meals were heavy, repetitive, and as exciting as a monk's Tuesday afternoon. Thick pottage, essentially medieval soup but sadder, was ladled into wooden bowls, often eaten twice a day, occasionally garnished with whatever could be foraged from the icy grip of the earth. Think turnips, onions, and dreams of meat. Meat, you see, was rare and therefore sacred, consumed sparingly or not at all through much of the winter. Salted pork, smoked fish, or dried sausage made guest appearances, singing salty ballads of sustenance before vanishing into the communal mouth. Butter and cheese might play supporting roles if your dairy animals had survived autumn with any milk-producing dignity intact. Water was a problem too. Rivers froze, wells iced over, and the concept of boiling water just for drinking was unheard of unless it was turning into ale. Which brings us to the unexpectedly cheerful hero of the season, low-alcohol ale. Drunk by young and old, not to party, but to avoid the gastrointestinal roulette represented by rural water supplies. This merry drink warmed the belly and clouded the senses, making cold nights pass just a little quicker, or at the very least, slightly more amusing. Religion wrapped itself around the daily routines like a faithful, if judgmental, cloak. Winters were spiritually rich times, full of saints' days, fasting days, and quiet prayers sent up through smoky rafters in hopes of divine insulation. The church offered guidance and, more importantly, calendars. Calendars told you when Lent would begin and when it might snow. Occasionally, one of those turned out to be correct. And so, layer by layer, prayer by prayer, cough by communal cough, the medieval peasant did what humans have always done in the face of an inconvenient climate: shared warmth, shared burdens, and perhaps, after enough ale, even shared a laugh. And just beyond that laughter, as the goats settle and the fire sputters, we find ourselves drifting gently toward the next curious comfort that carried them through the frost. If the medieval peasant had a prized possession beyond their loyal goat, or a surprisingly judgmental chicken, it was undoubtedly their mattress, or rather, their version of a mattress, which was often a lumpy, fragrant sack of straw known fondly and accurately as a pallet. No, not like the kind you ship potatoes on, though, in fairness, both had approximately the same ergonomic value. But oh, what comfort was squeezed from those modest layers. These humble bedding assemblies were often stuffed with straw, hay, reeds, or in some slightly fancier cases, feathers. Fluffy contraband likely plucked from a chicken who'd most certainly protest if it could. The straw-stuffed sacks were changed seasonally, but let's not assume that was for freshness. It was more because the stuff began resembling an undercooked pancake, flat in the middle, and likely harboring a few spiders who refused to pay rent. Medieval folks, particularly peasants eager for a sliver of warmth in a stone and draft-filled room, would sometimes heap these straw pallets together for double or triple occupancy. Sharing body heat wasn't just a winter strategy, it was a bedtime routine. They slept in twos, threes, or the very medieval-sounding bundles, which essentially meant whoever fit in the bed stayed in the bed. Grandparents, children, visiting monks, house cats, each was welcomed into the thermal economy of the pillowless pile. Think of it like an organic 14th century weighted blanket, except the weight was mostly from that one uncle who snored like a trebuchet launching sheep. Now, Heating the room with fire wasn't always possible or, frankly, advisable. Thatched roofs and open flames were not friends, and it was more common than one might think for a cozy blaze to turn into a full-blown instructional PSA about medieval fire safety, sponsored by regret and the smouldering remains of someone's best wooden spoon. So in lieu of crackling fireplaces, peasants turned to time-tested traditions that involved less flame and more fabric. Enter the straw mattress's noble sidekick, the bed curtain. These billowing textiles weren't merely decorative attempts to spice up a very hay-heavy aesthetic. Drawing the curtains around the sleeping area did something marvelous for temperature. It trapped warm air, blocked drafts, and served as the medieval version of a privacy screen, both for preventing awkward eye contact with sleep-muttering relatives and for keeping in the modesty of dreams. Beds with enclosed curtains became common wherever one could cobble them together. 4 sticks and a few woolen sheets, and voila, you had yourself a poor man's canopy suite. Just ignore the chicken standing on your foot. In the coldest winters, people sometimes even slept dressed, wearing daytime garments straight into bed, occasionally adding an extra tunic or two. Some layered up with shaggy cloaks or wriggled into pelts like cocooned woodland creatures, hoping to sleep through to spring. Nightcaps were a genuine fashion necessity. These weren't the whimsical sort with pom-poms flopping around like a carnival decoration. They were functional, low profile, covering the ears and preserving precious head heat from vanishing into the cold void above the mattress. A medieval peasant understood what modern ears often forget. When your nose feels like an icicle, it's time to put a hat on indoors and stop pretending you're too tough for wool. And when covering the body wasn't enough, a surprisingly enterprising solution: the humble footstone. Heated in the hearth by day, it was wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed come nightfall. It radiated warmth long into the midnight hours, giving feet a cozy haven, if you didn't overshoot and burn your toes off. Timing, as ever, was everything. For couples, the shared body heat meant the difference between frostbite and function. Sleeping back-to-back under a thick layer of blankets, or just an old coat and moral support, became a nighttime art form. Some referred to this position as the furnace back, and in societies where central heating hadn't been invented yet, it may well have saved lives or marriages, possibly both. To the modern eye, these arrangements might appear rustic, threadbare, and distinctly non-luxurious, but for those who lived them, they were acts of knightly ingenuity, layered, communal, and surprisingly effective in staving off the cold grip of winter. And, as the wind wafted softly through the cracks in the cottage walls, as sleep crept in gently between shared breaths and borrowed blankets, there existed a certain coziness untouched by glass windows or thermostat dials. Next, let us tiptoe softly into the curious case of cold weather food. Warmth from within, stirred into hedgerow stews and humble porridges with just a sprinkling of imagination. As winter deepened in the medieval countryside, you might imagine peasants cursing the frost through chattering teeth, shivering by flickering candlelight and muttering, if only central heating had been invented a bit sooner. But lower your expectations, and perhaps your thermostat, for life in a medieval winter wasn't quite what Hollywood might have you believe. For one thing, they weren't constantly freezing. Surprisingly, medieval peasants were rather good at getting by. First, let's consider the humble medieval home. No, it wasn't insulated with sustainable hempcrete or equipped with radiant floor heating, but it wasn't completely useless either. Homes typically had thick, wattle and daub walls. Imagine a woven stick basket packed with a sticky mix of mud, straw, and the occasional bit of livestock gossip. These walls might not have won any architectural awards, but they held in some warmth. Roofs were thatched with layers of straw, excellent for insulation, and also excellent for harbouring mice, which, if nothing else, provided additional warmth through scurrying body heat. Win-win. The key to enduring winter wasn't just architectural, though. It was communal. Most peasant families slept together in a single room, often in one big bed, or collection of bedding materials loosely interpreted as a bed. The whole household hunkered down like a pile of sleepy badgers. Children, grandparents, a few chickens perhaps, all contributing their body heat to one another, possibly whether they wanted to or not. And then there were the clothes, which peasants wore like protective cocoons. Layers were everything. Linen shirts, covered with woolen tunics, cloaks, leggings and hoods. Think of it as fashion by necessity, pioneered centuries before the concept of layering for style hit the runways of modern Europe. These garments were rarely washed. Some historians say once a season was already testing the boundaries of ambition, but they were effective. And if they started to smell, well, so did everyone else. One's personal scent had the benefit of blending in. Notably, peasants didn't try to heat their entire house. They heated themselves and, to some extent, one small area within the house. The hearth, some version of a fireplace, usually sat in the center of the room. It may have been little more than a pile of smouldering logs, but that pile represented the heart of the home. During the day, the family would gather around it, and at night, they'd let it fade, covering embers with ash to keep them alive until morning. Firewood was precious. Peasants couldn't afford to let it vanish overnight in an ill-advised attempt at coziness. When firewood was scarce, because surprise, lords didn't always let you just waltz into the woods and grab it. Peasants got creative. Enter the peat. A dense, decomposed mass of ancient vegetation, peat could be dug up from bogland and dried into bricks. Not the world's most fragrant fuel, and it'll never be mistaken for vanilla-scented candles, but peat offered warmth without the danger of illegally collecting firewood from your lord's lands and getting scolded, or worse. And then there were cow dung cakes. This, dear listener, was not a bakery delicacy. Dried animal dung may not strike modern ears as a comforting fuel source, but it was widely used, particularly in the places where wood was rarer than a warm bath in January. Shaped into patties and left to dry in the sun, these manure muffins were surprisingly efficient and delightfully flammable. Peasants made them with care, perhaps even pride. When life gives you cows, make fireplace fuel. Food helped too. Hearty meals, when available, provided internal warmth. Winter pottages, those gloriously thick, bubbling stews of root vegetables, barley, and yesterday's leftovers, were a staple. Imagine a stew so thick your wooden spoon stood at attention. That spoon, probably shared among a dozen family members and only gently rinsed since Michaelmas, but still, the stew was hot, and that was what counted. But perhaps the most surprising comfort was mental. Medieval peasants didn't spend winter agonizing over frozen phone batteries or gas bills. Time slowed down. Fields slept beneath frost, and so did people. There was rhythm in the hardship. Days were short, nights long, and work reduced to necessities. Stories were told, songs sung, and community strengthened through the shared challenge. They endured because they had to, yes, but also because they built a way of life that curved with the seasons. and as the icy winds whispered through the eaves of their crude but resourceful homes, the world might have seemed quiet and still, but it wasn't lifeless. Beneath the frozen earth, seeds waited patiently for spring, just as the peasants did. And just beyond the threshold, across the frozen yard and into the rickety barn, something else was braving the cold with equal resilience. If you imagine yourself standing in a dim medieval cottage, surrounded by walls thick with daub and wattle, or as I like to call it, Mother Nature's original insulation, you'd notice something odd, something missing, a sound, or rather the glorious lack thereof. Yes, the peasant household was quiet, not because no one was talking, but because windows, if they existed at all, were generally holes with a wooden shutter, which meant they were tightly shut in winter, and sound, like warmth, didn't particularly travel in or out. This brings us, dreamily and without rush, to an overlooked marvel of the medieval winter: silence. Unlike our buzzing modern lives filled with humming fridges, beeping gadgets, and that eternally impatient microwave, the medieval winter was a sonic hibernation. There were no honking carts at night, no friendly playlist from the neighbour's half-broken lute, just the croak of a sleepy rooster and the occasional grumble of someone stepping on a dog in the dark, because of course, dogs slept indoors, especially in winter, a source of both warmth and surprise ankle licks. But among the softer sounds filling a peasant's long night in winter was the quiet rhythm of communal comfort. Layers of humanity bundled and bunched like a medieval lasagna, sharing a single bed. Now, don't picture a four-poster with silk sheets. Think more along the lines of a straw-filled mattress that squeaked when you so much as dreamed about moving. Beds were shared by entire families, parents, children, the occasional granny or grumpy uncle, and sometimes even guess if the hearth was busy or the roads were impassable. In the economics of body heat, everyone had a valuable thermal contribution to make, and they didn't just lie there shivering stoically. No, they had tactics. For instance, foot warming, an accepted and relished winter sport that involved nestling one's icy feet against the warmest, most heavily blanketed person nearby. It often sparked some sleepy complaints, but also a humble recognition of mutual dependence and cold toes. Then there was the sleepwear, or lack thereof. Contrary to what your favorite historical drama might have you believe, medieval peasants didn't always lounge around in matching hand-embroidered nightgowns. Sometimes they wore whatever they hadn't already burned for fuel. Clothes layered by necessity, often kept on for days or weeks through the long frost. Linen shirts became pajamas, tunics turned into makeshift quilts, and frankly, everyone ranked on the scale somewhere between a touch musty and has evolved to a new ecosystem. As tempting as it is to imagine freezing villagers glaring at their frost-laced windows like characters in a melancholy oil painting, it wasn't all gloom and doom. Amid the shiver and sheltering, there thrived the oldest form of indoor heating: storytelling. Fireside tales were the Netflix of the Middle Ages, with no remote required, though plenty of yelling at the storyteller when they forgot the names. Peasants told folk tales, fables, bits of local history, and outrageously incorrect gossip about nobles 3 valleys over. Children loved a good ghost story. Adults enjoyed the more scandalous yarns. Everyone passed the time, passing on stories as old as the draft coming in through the doorframe. There was a certain simplicity to the entertainment, a communal hush as the fire flickered, a few giggles here and there, maybe a stolen yawn. It's worth picturing. Wrinkled faces lit by flames, woolen scarves clumsily tied, bits of barley bread clutched in sleepy hands, and above all, that hush. A hush so profound that it seemed to absorb even the cold. And if silence was the song of winter, then light was its shy soloist. The peasant's world was not flooded with fluorescent bulbs or hour-long romantic candlelit dinners. There were humble rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat, or simple oil lamps which produced more smoke than scents. If you were lucky, you had a sputtering candle. If you weren't, you relied on moonlight crawling through the shutters. Either way, bedtime came early. This low level of light wasn't just tradition, it was survival. Lighting the house required fuel, and fuel, dear dreamer, was to be hoarded like dragon gold. If nothing else, medieval winters taught patience and the unique art of stumbling into furniture in absolute darkness. Eventually, the stories quieted, the yawns grew louder, and the house tucked itself in under the weight of its own weariness. The sleeping bodies, wrapped in layers and dreams, listened one last time to the crackle of the fire sputtering into embers, fading just as gently as the wind beyond the wall. And come morning, they'd wake, still cold, still together, but ready for whatever the frost-scuffed world had in store. But before we get there, let's drift a little deeper into the secret world of medieval warmth. Not by firelight this time, but by community, and something called bed warming. Yes, it gets better, or at least weirder. Picture it, a frost-laced morning, somewhere in the English countryside, ducks grumbling on a half-frozen pond, and a peasant named Wulfric beginning to defrost in tiny increments beneath 4 layers of wool, a dog, and sheer medieval willpower. The sun, if one could call it that, squinted discouragingly through the murk as villagers stirred in their timber and thatch homes. There was no thermostat to punch in frustration, no heated blanket to burrito oneself in. Just routine. That stoic, stubborn rhythm of winter survival. By this chapter in the peasant's pattern of cold weather life, we must speak of that unsung hero, the communal effort. You see, no medieval peasant was truly alone in their suffering. Everyone was cold. Everyone smelled faintly of turnips and damp wool. And so, rather than wallow in their own drafty silences, they did the only sensible thing. They huddled. Families slept like nested spoons in a single bed, nestled beneath wool blankets, patched linens, straw-stuffed mattresses, and possibly a cat or two specifically trained in the noble art of foot warming. Privacy took a nap until April. Sleeping fully clothed wasn't laziness, it was necessary. Taking off garments at night meant putting on frosty cloth in the morning. Why wake up just to be instantly betrayed by your own trousers? Long tunics, underdresses, shawls, and caps stayed on, creating personal microclimates. The most daring wore nightcaps, not for style, though nothing screams allure like a sagging linen cornucopia atop your head, but to trap in what little body heat the ever-ambitious knight could not touch. Sometimes, families even shared sleeping space with their livestock. A cow in the corner could mean the difference between frostbite and merely blue toes. Pigs, though not especially hygienic roommates, put out a surprising amount of heat. Chickens were less helpful but dramatically more insulted about being invited indoors. Now let's talk about wind, the invisible villain in every medieval winter tale. Picture a wind so persistent it could slip through the cracks of your cottage like gossip. Houses built, largely of wattle and daub, were charmingly rustic and completely uninsulated. In fact, the materials were essentially natural air conditioning in reverse. But never let it be said that medieval peasants weren't resourceful. Some pasted extra layers of plaster over their walls to block the breeze. Others hung tapestries, yes, the same ones with questionable depictions of saints slaying dragons, as offerings to insulation rather than interior design. A large piece of fabric could cut down a cruel draught better than reason or prayer. Wool was preferred, linen if you were lucky, and fur, well, let's just say that was for people one might call modestly better off, or suspiciously cozy looking through winter. For the windows, medieval windows, often merely holes with shutters. If you were fancy, maybe you had oiled parchment stretched across the opening, a sort of proto-curtain that afforded no real clarity, just a gentle sort of blur, making the outside world permanently gloomy and unknowably cold. If visibility was needed, one opened the shutter, then promptly regretted it. Communication and company helped pass the long, cold evenings. Be it storytelling, singing, or that old classic, complaining, a communal evening gathered by the embers wasn't just for warmth. It was for morale. Laughter, after all, is slightly warmer than silence. And when the wind howled too much through the thatch, well, sometimes people just went to bed early, very early, as in the sun is slightly lower than usual, and now everyone's horizontal for 12 hours. When daylight is rationed and candles are costly, sleep becomes a winter sport. And so, peasants might get in what's called segmented sleep. 2 distinct phases of rest, with a wakeful period in the middle, known quaintly as the watch. Ah yes, the watch, with its own rituals. People might smoke meats in the chimney corner, stoke the fire, whisper prayers, perhaps sneak out to the latrine with heroic levels of indignation, or simply stare at the rafters pondering the mysteries of existence, such as, what is that smell? And is it looking at me? But the rhythm of these long nights, deeply bodily and deeply communal, created a kind of sleepy resilience. One didn't conquer winter. One outlasted it, inch by inch, wool thread by wool thread. And with each creak of a settling beam or rustic snore from a nearby sibling, was the quiet consolation that, yes, one was still alive, yes, still cold, but not alone. As the fire's glow dimmed to smoulder, and the wind's howl was muffled by mildew-scented tapestries, the hamlet hunkered into its dreamlike pause, suspended between seasons and snows. And somewhere between second sleep and tomorrow's dawn, our peasant world turns its thoughts, softly, sleepily, toward what always followed winter's grip, the promise, however faint, of warmth. Let's wander a little closer to that promise. By now, you've almost wound your way through the labyrinthine lanes of medieval winter survival. And what a patchwork quilt of hay beds, smoky hearths, and frostbitten ingenuity it's been. But before we tuck in entirely, let's slow our pace and peek inside one of the lesser known, but wonderfully peculiar realms of peasant preparation. Medieval winter fashion. Yes, fashion. Not of the Versailles ball or Renaissance runway variety, mind you, but rather the humble stylings of those who could not afford a second chicken, let alone a velvet doublet. And yet, in the depths of December, survival depended every bit as much on clever layering as it did on the contents of one's larder. Our medieval peasant, let's call him Wolf, would begin his defense against the cold, not with grand cloaks or lined boots, but with wool. Glorious, scratchy, homespun wool, thickly woven from the local sheep, dyed in hues dictated primarily by mud and accidents. Brown was the new black, and grey was considered a shade of aristocracy if it was clean. Wolf's winter wear likely began with the brays, which were loose undergarments that bore a mild resemblance to flouncy shorts, held up with a drawstring and dignity. Over those came the tunic, a long woolen shirt that might double as pajamas if needed. Then came another tunic, because layering in medieval Britain was not just a lifestyle. It was a necessity, a philosophy, a frontier medical recommendation. But as wise as the layering might seem, this was not a purely snug affair. Fabric was precious, sewing was slow, and the wind was utterly disrespectful. Cloaks, often fastened with a simple wooden or iron brooch, billowed like sails in the winter wind, giving the wearer the elegant silhouette of a particularly fashionable bat. Still, it kept most of the frost off one's back, or at least away from the nicer parts of the back, now socks, or hose as they were gallantly known, narrow tubes of wool tugged up as far as they dared. Not quite socks and not quite trousers. Hose had a charming way of falling down at the worst moments, frozen knees included. And as for shoes, well, at best, they were leather slip-ons, sometimes stuffed with straw, and at worst, no shoes at all. Yes, some peasants went barefoot, even in snow, presumably developing calluses thick enough to write on. Woolen mittens were occasionally crafted, but far more common was simply tucking one's hands inside those bat-like cloaks and refusing to make any sudden movements. As for headwear, few items were as universally accepted as the coif, a snug cloth cap tied beneath the chin, which protected the ears, the scalp, and most of one's dignity. Stay still, and you might be mistaken for a monk. Nod too swiftly, and you'd resemble a befuddled toddler. On particularly frigid nights, it wasn't uncommon for villagers to line their clothing with feathers, moss, or even scraps of old parchment. Yes, the medieval world occasionally embraced the idea that knowledge, at least on paper, could keep you warm. Let us not forget the importance of sleepwear, which was typically all the day's clothes rearranged intimately around a straw mattress. Wolf may have kept his cloak on, curled his feet under his tunic, and wrapped his coiffed head in yet another rag. It was less about fashion and more about fort building, really. A small textile fortress against the creeping cold. And for all the hardship, there was warmth to be found in this ragtag assembly. The warmth of shared fires, of nearby bodies crowded on hay, and of laughter that couldn't help but echo, even when breath turned to mist in the moonlight. So the next time you grumble about itchy scarves or argue with your radiator, remember Wolf and his woolen empire. Remember the straw in shoes, the cloak caught in the wind, and the quiet courage of tying your coif one-handed at dawn. But the candle of night is still flickering gently, and there's another corner of the medieval winter world waiting to be warmed. Let's amble there soon, under starlight and wool. While we might think of winter as a time for fluff-lined slippers and heated throws, a medieval peasant might find the concept of indoor warmth something akin to sorcery or extreme upper-class luxury. But as snow powdered over thatched rooftops and frost crept through every chink in a wooden wall, peasants didn't just freeze in place like mismatched candlesticks. They had, on-the-ground survival strategies, rather damp ones sometimes. Let's tiptoe into the heart of a medieval cottage during the raw chill of midwinter, where the fire, if one is going at all, is more of a smoky suggestion than a blazing centerpiece. Remember, chimneys were still figuring themselves out, so any fire built would have filled the room with a thick fog of eye-watering intrigue. The hole in the roof, that was the chimney, efficient in theory, romantic in absolutely no way at all. Yet warmth wasn't entirely elusive. It started with the layers. So many layers. Clothing was continuously worn. Peasants slept in what they wore during the day, over not quite washed tunics made of wool so prickly you'd suspect it held a personal grudge. Underclothing was rare, wool was abundant, and linen, when affordable, was the closest thing to breathable, moisture-wicking technology. Just not in January. Whole households often slept together in the same bed or tucked into one room. It wasn't scandalous. It was thermodynamic teamwork. The shared body heat of 2 parents, 3 children, an elderly grandmother, and, yes, a chicken or 2 created a cozy biosphere of barely tolerable temperatures. Privacy was a summer option. And animals. Oh yes, the animals were part of the equation. Pigs, goats, and even a cow, if you were lucky, might share your abode. Not for social company exactly, but for the lovely thermal inertia of livestock. Cow breath may not stir tender sonnets, but when the air hits, below freezing and the walls are thin, even a snoring hound or shivering hen becomes a plush approximation of comfort. Meanwhile, cook fires were built more for necessity than ambience. A bubbling pot of pottage, something between a stew and ceremonial sludge, would be left simmering over embers as long as the fire could tolerate it. This had the delightful side effect of occasionally warming the room and the less delightful one of attracting rodents with ambitions. But our frosty peasants worked with what they had. Rushlights, a sort of medieval candle born from soaked reeds coated in leftover animal fat, offered a dim and smoky glow. Not much in the way of heat, but a little psychological warmth goes far when you're swaddled in wool and questioning your life choices. Even the house itself was built around the idea of surviving cold months. Thick soiled walls stuffed with wattle and daub, though drafty, had a sort of muddy insulation vibe. Floors, if not simply dirt, were strewn with straw or herbs, both to soak up moisture and to provide some buffer between your foot and the earth's frozen disagreement. Spiritual warmth helped too. The winter months were laced with holy days, feasts, and communal rituals. Around Christmastide or Yuletide in earlier times, villages gathered to light candles, sing songs, and tell stories until they could convince themselves they were warmer from a simple shared smile. The fact that people looked forward to the smell of mulled ale and the rare treat of winter honey cakes proved that even perpetual shivering didn't sap all joy from the season. Some homes in parts of medieval Germany and the Low Countries experimented with real innovations. Early Hipparchus-like warming systems borrowed from long-lost Roman blueprints. And in Scandinavian lands, those clever folks dug houses partly into the earth, embracing geothermal patience with enviable calm. But for most peasants, winter wasn't bested. It was negotiated with layers, laughter, livestock, and the quiet faith that eventually the thaw would come. And when that thaw began, oh, the muddy joy of it. But first, one more icy night in the close company of woolen dreams, shared snores, and the faint hiss of something vaguely soup-like daring to boil. Tomorrow, light would shift through the cracked shutters with a promise as old as winter itself, that even the coldest comfort has its end. At last, a hush falls over the snowy village, where chimney smoke winds like sleepy thoughts into the night sky, and candlelight flickers behind frost-laced windows. We've wandered far through muddy paths and icy thresholds, peered into cold hearths and codified customs, and now we find ourselves at winter's quietest hour, the moment where even the livestock seem to snore in tandem. The medieval peasant, contrary to the romantic tales spun centuries later, was not a figure of constant misery. Hardy, yes, but also surprisingly inventive. The cold could chip away at the body, but the will to warm oneself, body and soul, was undefeatable, especially when one didn't have a central heating system and was instead relying on a smoky fire with more ambition than heat output. By winter's end, the peasant cottage often smelled like a mashup of damp wool, sun-dried herbs, and something that can only be described as slightly hopeful turnip. Yet it was here, amid the straw-stuffed bedding and low-beamed ceilings, that warmth was made, not found. Goose fat rubbed into cracked knuckles, a worn cat curled around bare ankles like a living slipper, and the unmatched magical insulation power of having your entire extended family sleep in the same bed, possibly with a chicken or two for added warmth. Of course, if one was lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you feel about nocturnal noises, there might be a sleeping platform above the hearth, a sort of medieval heated mattress pad, where the oldest child, the grandmother, or the drunkest uncle might claim a toasty perch. Below, everyone else laid bundled like cabbage rolls in the homespun blankets, so scratchy they could double as exfoliants. Hunger, too, was a kind of cold. But even then, creative recipes came to the rescue. There were pottages so thick with root vegetables they could briefly double as construction mortar. Ale was served, not chilled, but lukewarm and vaguely suspicious. On feast days, a communal pork pie might make the rounds, often with more crust than meat, but who was counting when it was hot? And speaking of community, the medieval village was stitched together not just by need, but by neighbourly invention. People shared body heat like currency. Alehouses brimmed even in snowstorms, and the village church, often slightly less frozen than the outdoors, provided not only spiritual guidance, but also a place to loiter semi-legally and bask near a candle or two. Even medieval games helped banish the cold. There was Snapdragon, a merrily hazardous game involving brandy-soaked raisins set alight and plucked from flames. Essentially, a legitimate winter game of burning one's fingertips for dessert's sake. Church authorities frowned, villagers laughed, and children, cloaked in layers like tiny walking onions, watched wide-eyed and waited for their turn. Poetry and songs provided heat of a different sort. The oral tradition marched steadily on, even when boots did not. Around the hearth, someone might recite tales of Arthurian glory, or an old farming rhyme, or something tragic and romantic about a shepherd who accidentally married his goat. Memory warmed the cold corners of the soul, and laughter lit up the shadowy rafters better than any candle. But most effective of all, and sweetest by far, was sleep itself. Sleep came early in those long winter months, deep and dark like an inkwell dream. After supper and storytelling, families retreated to their straw beds, wrapping themselves in each other and what few blankets they had, cocooning until the first hint of pale dawn broke frost from the thatch. There was no Netflix queue, no midnight snack runs, only the cough of an ox, the sleepy murmur of a child, and the slow shifting of the wind through timber walls. They drifted off not to glowing screens, but to the contented creak of the roof beams and the familiar weight of closeness. And tonight, just like them, you may find that warmth is not always a temperature. Sometimes it's an idea, an old story, a shared sigh beneath the covers. Maybe, just maybe, you're curled up now, blanketed against modern worries, watching the firelight dance on the fictional beams of your mind. So let yourself wander backward into slumber, where winter is only half real, and peasants smile sleepily from behind their hearthstones. The fire may have dimmed, but in this dreamy village, sleep is the warmest blanket of them all. Good night, traveller, and may your dreams be draught-free.